Welcome to the Faith Radio Reading the Bible Together podcast. I'm your host, Angela Smith. For this series, we're reading through the first 6 chapters of Daniel, and our hope is that as we study the lives of Daniel and his friends, you will be encouraged to stand up for your faith while also exhibiting courage, wisdom, and respect. This week, we are covering the first chapter of Daniel. Joining me this week also is University of Northwestern Bible professor Anna Rask. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So glad. Okay, so it is time to finally dig in.
Yes.
I'm so excited. So what do we need to know before we start reading Daniel 1?
Yeah, I want to set the stage for us. I want to give us the context about what has been going on in the world when we open Daniel chapter 1. And so give us a little dates, history, empires, people in power. So that's what I want to start with for us today.
Great. Well, let's just dig in.
All right. So when we open the book of Daniel, we see that this guy Nebuchadnezzar is coming against the people of Judah. Judah is the southern nation of the Israelite people. They split in 931 BC after the reign of Solomon, and we had the northern nation and the southern nation. The northern nation fell in 721 to the Assyrians, and Judah was able to stay strong. But then Babylon comes on the scene, and that's where it gets risky. And God had foretold that they would fall to the Babylonians.
So it's like 200 years later.
Yep. So they still hung on for a little while longer, and that's mainly because, God was gracious with them. These are the Davidic kings. They had some good kings that still pursued following after the Lord.
Wow.
Yeah, so Nebuchadnezzar is going to come against the people of Judah, and he, in 605 BC, comes to Judah and compels the king of Judah. We're going to get all these names here, but the king of Judah at that time is Jehoiakim. And he says, okay, you're going to become my vassal, and you're going to pay me tribute. And so he makes them his vassals, but he also deports one group of people. And this is Daniel and his friends, and we'll talk about why Daniel and his friends were taken in just a second here. This is probably not a good idea. Jehoiakim rebels, and in 598, he is put in chains and taken off to Babylon himself, where he later dies. And a guy with a similar name, Jehoiachin, takes the throne in Judah, and he rules for 3 months there, and he's going to rebel. And so a few years later, 597, Nebuchadnezzar responds to that rebellion with another deportation, and this is actually when the prophet Ezekiel is deported to Babylon. And so we hear Ezekiel and his prophecies coming from that nation. And we see that Nebuchadnezzar invades Jerusalem, he lays siege to it, and he takes all the treasures from the palace and the temple, and he puts his puppet king on the throne, who is named Zedekiah. And they don't learn their lessons. Zedekiah rebels as well. And finally, Nebuchadnezzar comes back, and for about 3 years, he puts a siege on the city, and it is, a time of hunger and thirst. Cannibalism actually occurs. It is not a good time for the people of Judah, but it culminates in the destruction of the city. The temple of God is destroyed, and the last group of people from Judah are deported. So it's a tragedy for these people.
It's interesting to think about how each of those kings stood up and rebelled against him, because we'll see that moving forward in Daniel, that same kind of strength of conviction.
Yeah, they don't want to be conquered,
right.
But there are consequences that they see for rebelling against this much more powerful ruler. But that was in essence.
I'm probably not the only one who's like envisioning VeggieTales.
Yeah,
right now,
exactly.
And Nebuchadnezzar.
I admit that I do show one video in my class of VeggieTales, and I think the students appreciate that. Yeah. But this was the Babylonian strategy. They would exile whole nations to other lands, in particular the royals and the elites, and that's what Daniel and his friends were. They were nobles, and really they wanted to remove the leadership from those conquered lands so that they could put the leaders they wanted in charge, like Zedekiah, and then they could build up their own nation and their own government with really intelligent, skilled individuals. And so they wanted to train these exiles to learn the ways of Babylon so that they could later serve the empire, either in Babylon or their conquered territories. And this was a 3-year training typically before they would enter royal service. And so that's who Daniel and his friends were. They were nobles and potentially may have been related to King Hezekiah.
Wow. And do we know how old they were when they were taken?
They were probably teenagers. We're going to see Daniel live all the way through the rest of the Babylonian Empire and into the Persian Empire. And he's probably in his 80s at that time. Wow. And he might have even lived into his 90s. So he is like there his whole life. So not an easy situation.
No, not at all.
Yeah. So we learn that, they might be related to Hezekiah. Isaiah 39, verse 7, actually gives some interesting information. Isaiah is talking to Hezekiah, and he's prophesying that some of his sons, meaning descendants, will be taken into exile. They'll become eunuchs, and they'll serve in the palace of Babylon's king. Mm-hmm. And so we're questioning, is that a reference to Daniel and his friends? So
interesting.
They were taken not just because they're nobles, but also Babylon was looking for like the right physical qualities. They apparently were handsome, they were young, they were quick learners, and they were going to be trained. They were going to be trained in the language and literature of the Babylonians. They were completely immersed in the culture of their enemies.
So they're learning the language, they're learning. Was there a religion that was?
Yeah. So for the language, we learned that they were probably learning the Akkadian language. That was the native language of the Babylonians. So they had to learn a whole brand new language. And then in terms of religion, they were probably indoctrinated with the religion of Babylon, which was very idolatrous. They were polytheistic. Their main god, though, of the god of the city of Babylon, was Marduk. There's a big temple that has been uncovered, or they've discovered that the remains of this was the temple to Marduk. These Babylonians practiced divination. They believed in omens. Omens were the primary way that gods revealed their will or intentions. And divination was a learned practice that these people learned about foreshadowing events with certain signs. So this is where it gets weird, especially when I'm talking with my students. We're talking horoscopes, looking at the stars, eclipses, flight patterns of birds, casting lots. If an animal had a unusual birth defect, or even the placement of animal organs and their livers, all of these things were viewed as omens about the future, about what the gods were doing. And it was a practice, it was a study that they would participate in. And this would help them make decisions regarding politics, military conquests, and agriculture. So Daniel and his friends were being trained as these religious gurus and trend spotters, political consultants, and we hear about wise men, but these are also
I just have to backtrack.
Magicians. Yeah.
So that's the training, because we see that Nebuchadnezzar is calling on his magicians.
Yep.
And so that's...
Yeah, Daniel's receiving most likely all of this training. He's regarded as one of Nebuchadnezzar's wise men. And so then when there's a threat put out against the wise men in chapter 2, that includes Daniel and his friends.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I just thought it was like language and culture. I didn't realize it was almost like a priesthood.
Magic,
kind of.
Yeah. It's magic, it's divination, and that's a very real thing that other nations around Israel practiced.
Wow.
And what we hear is that Daniel and his friends are at the top of their class. They're doing well. They're very quick to learn. We don't yet hear about their convictions about these matters, but we will soon. And we're going to see why Daniel's continued called upon time and time again to help out when some of these situations arise.
Wow. So then how do we see them kind of respond to this education?
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll mention is that, they're being totally indoctrinated. Their lives are being changed. We also hear about a name change for them too. That is not something that I imagine they were super thrilled about, because names were often connected to someone's deity and really integrally connected to their identity. And so to have your name changed is kind of a stripping of your identity. Mm-hmm. We hear Daniel referred to by Daniel a lot in this book, but he does get a Babylonian name. So in Hebrew, Daniel means God is my judge. And you can hear in the last two letters, El, that's God's name. Elohim in Hebrew is God. And so El is a shortened form of that. So God is my judge. But he gets a new name, Belshazzar. Scholars kind of question exactly what it means, but it's probably a reference to Bel, a god, which was likely a reference to Marduk. Bel means Lord or Master. So it's about, may that God protect my life, or may that God protect the king. And so that's a whole nother God that they think is a God, that Daniel's name is now being identified with. And potentially these men were also made eunuchs. That's what's referenced in Isaiah. Some of Hezekiah's descendants will be taken to Babylon and made eunuchs. And so in a sense of their gender identity, sexual identity being stripped as well. So these men were losing everything.
Right.
Until finally we do hear where they choose to make a stand. And it has to do with their diet. They're provided certain food during this education process. And the narrative tells us that Daniel chooses to not defile himself by eating this food that is provided by the king. And this is a debated topic of why he said no to this.
Because that seems a really interesting place to take a stand when you're being taught to be a magician.
Yeah, all sorts of other stuff. And maybe he didn't see a way that he could take a stand in those areas. We'll see him react in situations where he gives God the glory in the future for divination-related circumstances. So who knows why, but this is the area he chooses to take a stand. And he says, I'm not going to eat the meat or wine that's provided to me. I would like me and my friends to just eat vegetables and water. And so some people are questioning, okay, why did he do that? Was it because he's trying to stay kosher according to Jewish law? Well, Jewish law didn't say that you had to refuse wine. You could drink wine. So some scholars are like, well, that doesn't seem right. Some other scholars suggest that maybe the food was first offered to idols and then brought to the king's table. So they're maybe like, okay, well, Daniel didn't want to participate. Well, who's to say the vegetables weren't also offered to gods as well? Another option is to eat at the king's table might signal kind of an acceptance of this treaty or relationship that you have with the king. Maybe Daniel's refusing that, but he does so very privately, so it wasn't really making a stand. The view that I align with goes with the textbook I wrote. It's connected with Tremper Longman's commentary. He is suggesting that everything about Daniel and his friends' lives is being fed by the Babylonian court. Their prosperity, their development, their success can be attributed to the Babylonians. But if they took a stand against the king and just chose vegetables and water, they were basically refusing the king to get the glory for their health and for their well-being. They were taking a stand and saying, we're entrusting ourselves to God. King Nebuchadnezzar, you're not getting the glory for our health and well-being. And actually, they look healthier at the end of this 10-day process than the other individuals who are eating the meats and the wines, and they're giving God the glory for that. They've just been surviving on a vegetarian diet, basically, and they look better. They look healthier, and they give God the glory. And it's only a temporary thing. We hear about him eating meat later in life, but it seems like he's trying to just make a stand somewhere and say, God's getting the glory, not Nebuchadnezzar.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's just so much good information.
I know, there's a lot. There's so much beyond this book. Yeah.
So let's kind of go to the questions for the study guide. So for those of you that are sitting at the table with us listening, there's a study guide that you can find at myfaithradio.com, and we'll just touch on a few of the questions that are on that study guide. So the first one is, although Daniel 1 makes it seem as though Babylon is in control, what does verse 2 reveal about who is actually in control? Yeah,
you actually hear it said that God is the one giving the people of Judah over to Nebuchadnezzar. You'd think Nebuchadnezzar, the major world power, is the one doing this, but God's the one who's actually in control. And he is, we learn later in the book that this is all happening because they broke the covenant. They sinned against God, and there are real consequences. And so it's not as though God has stepped aside and like, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, you take over. God is still in control and is working in all of these circumstances.
So it's more like a time of correction and discipline.
It's a consequence. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the next question is, although Daniel and his friends underwent an intensive 3-year re-education process, in what area did they stand against Babylon?
Yeah.
We talked about that with the food. I still think that's so interesting, though, that that's where they chose to take a stand.
It doesn't clarify why, but maybe that's the only option they had. I mean, I can't pretend to suppose what life was like for them.
And maybe that felt accessible. Like you said, like I can't stand up against in all of these in their religious areas, but maybe in the food that felt like maybe this is a time of them testing out.
Yeah.
I'm going to stand for God, and then we see them take
bigger,
grander steps.
They do get bolder for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've said that his friends that we've been referring to are...
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those are their Babylonian names. Their other names, Hebrew names, are Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael. And you hear a lot of and L's, and that's that reference to God and the term Yahweh, his personal name. So Azariah, for example, means Yah, or Yahweh is my help. And we know them by their Babylonian names. So Abednego means servant of Nabu, the god of art and literacy and wisdom. So, yeah.
Or if you watch VeggieTales, you know them as Rack, Shack, and Benny.
Yes. yes.
Okay, so the next one is note the places in chapter 1 where Daniel exhibits courage, wisdom, and also respect. And that's one thing I really appreciate is that he's taking a stand, but doing it respectfully.
Yeah. He's not putting up a huge public fuss necessarily. He does it very respectfully, but he is also presented throughout this whole book as just this figure of wisdom. And we can't necessarily replicate all the behavior of Daniel, but we can have some takeaways for how we engage with our culture. And Daniel 1 shows us that. It shows us that Daniel's not just smart intellectually. He's wise, and those can be different things. At least in terms of biblical wisdom, Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And Daniel does just that. He fears God, and he respectfully asks for the menu to be changed. He was tactful. He knew who to talk to, and he didn't make a fuss. He asked respectfully.
Well, and what I appreciate about it, too, is that I can't remember who it was that he talked to about it, but they were worried that they would get in trouble.
Yeah.
And so Daniel worked with them to figure out something. Well, let's test it then.
Yeah. He comes up with the idea of the test. And we see that God honors that. And it specifically says God gives the chief official sympathy towards Daniel. So God is honoring the stand that Daniel's taking. And I think that shows us Daniel is certainly in the world, but not of it. He is making more of a quiet statement of boldness, but we will see him probably grow in his boldness. If he's just like coming out of his late teens and into his 20s, he's just maturing as well into adulthood.
What is it, the prefrontal cortex?
Yes. Yeah, that's out of my league. Yeah.
And then the last question is, can you think of any examples of how the culture in which you live is at odds with the Bible and the Christian message? How could you boldly stand up for your faith while also exhibiting courage, wisdom, and respect?
Yeah, and that's, definitely a personal question I pose to the audience of, can you sit and think about it? And I ask that question, the same question to my students, and sometimes it goes back to high school, like, hey, what were you like in high school? Were there ways, like, if you're in a public school or a setting amongst friends that you chose to take a stand? Hey, I'm not going to watch that. I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not going to go to that party, something like that. And I think that gets them to think about the pressure, peer pressure and pressure to conform, and that they're going to say, this is not something God would want me to do, and I'm going to honor him in that. And I believe that God honors that decision. Yeah.
And even when we're adults, sometimes there are those tough decisions that we have to make to take a stand, and I think sometimes it can feel just as hard.
Yeah.
Even as an adult.
Yeah, I completely agree. These men were in adulthood, and we're going to see Daniel in the lion's den. He was probably in his 80s, and that still would have been a really tough decision for him to stand up against the king. Yeah.
Well, this has been wonderful. I am so glad that you have joined us for this conversation. We've gone through Daniel chapter 1, and tomorrow we will be going through Daniel chapter 2. I hope you'll join us.
The Reading the Bible Together podcast is a production of Faith Radio and Northwestern Media. Hosted, produced, and edited by Angela Smith. Special thanks to Professor Anna Rask. If you've enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, consider financially supporting Faith Radio. Find more information at myfaithradio.com.